I was just scrolling through Instagram mindlessly, as a millennial does, and I noticed this video of a bunch of artists who were chipping at a wall. And they did that so many times across a wide space on the wall that eventually it looked like a very detailed work of art. And that got me thinking, if I were to make a chip randomly on that wall, is it going to ruin the integrity of what was done? And I thought, probably not, right? If I just made one chip somewhere just randomly, because I have no idea how they're placing these chips so perfectly to get such a detailed image, it might not be obvious that I did that because it would be hidden in this beautiful work of art. But then if I did that enough times, it would start to actually become obvious as time goes on. But at what point does it start to become obvious, right? On the flip side of that, I started to think, at what point does all of these chips that they're making on the wall start to actually look like a face? Is there a particular point where it starts to look like a face? Is there a particular chip that changes this image from something that is vague to something that is actually noticeable as a human face? And I don't think there is. I think it's such a gradual process that's going on in the brain if we are to watch this image go from one that doesn't make any sense to one that does. And then this got me thinking about consciousness. You know, that Buddhist idea of consciousness and self and identity. It's like, what makes the essence of something? What makes the essence of me? Is it my hand? If I were to lose my hand or my leg or some part of my body, would I lose the essence of myself? And it's pretty obvious that in the same way one chip on that wall does not make that art to appear or disappear, so too a part of myself does not make the me that I am. But there is no central part of myself. There's no central chip on that wall of art that once taken out makes a difference. It doesn't matter where you take that out of, right? I guess the analogy kind of falls apart when you consider things like the heart or the head, but still it follows through in the sense that you can't have a head that doesn't have a body. So you still need the other components, or you can't have a heart that doesn't have the other parts of the body. So as central as those parts are, you still need the rest all together to be able to function properly. And again, it took me to that idea of consciousness. Oftentimes, we think of it as something that's on and off. There's this long-running debate on how consciousness comes about. And I'm thinking maybe consciousness is not, and I'm sure I'm not the first person to think about this, by the way, but I'm thinking maybe consciousness is not something that's on or off. It's not one central component that decides whether there's going to be consciousness or not, that determines whether there's going to be consciousness or not, but rather the amalgamation of all of these components put together that creates that anomaly that we call consciousness, or that creates that anomaly that we call identity, whether it's ourselves or a chair that we're considering. Like, what makes a chair a chair? Is it the legs? Is it the part that we sit on? Is it the part that we rest our backs on? It's all of these things together. And trying to look at it in terms of individual parts as what is making the whole does not really give us any insight on what it means to have that identity, right? That identity of being a chair or being a human or having consciousness. So what is the implication of this insight? Honestly, I have no idea. I just thought about it, and I know it does have some implication as far as how we think about certain things. I'm just not quite sure what that is yet, and I might have to be re-exposed to someone talking about the implications of it, or perhaps think of it myself, but I don't know. So if any of you can think of what the implication of that is, then I would be happy to hear. But if not, then I just thought it was an interesting thought. Well, I thought that was the end of the video, but as I was editing it to post, two implications actually dawned on me. One is more philosophical, the other is more practical. I'll start with the philosophical one, and it has to do with the Buddhist concept again. It's usually to point at the insignificance, for lack of a better word, of our emotions. Insignificant not in the sense that it's not important, but insignificant in the sense that our emotions alone are not something that we should identify with, even though that is naturally what we tend to do. But when we consider that mural, our emotions are just one chip of the many different pieces that it takes to make us who we are. And yet we seem to put far more weight on those emotions than they actually deserve. And again, I don't think it's to say that we shouldn't take them seriously or we shouldn't try to figure them out, because every single piece of that puzzle, every single chip on that wall, every single component that makes up the whole does matter in its own small way, but it's not the whole. And I think that is what is most important to keep in mind. I think that is at the crux of the Buddhist idea that emotions are not to be identified with. And not only because they are just one out of a plethora of components that make us who we are, but also because of how transient they are. right? These emotions are constantly in flux. And so to identify with them not only doesn't make sense in a holistic sense, but also doesn't make sense in terms of just the sheer reliability of that fickle emotion. And I think such a view might help us to let go a little bit more of emotions instead of clinging to them as they roll us down the hill. So now the practical implication. Well, I think abortion has to be at least one of the practical implications, because the long-standing debate on when a fetus gains consciousness, if that is what we should use to determine whether an abortion is appropriate or not, is not something that's clear, right? If it takes a lot of different components to finally imbue that entity with consciousness, then who's to determine exactly where that consciousness is and where it's not? So it's obvious that there is a point where there's no consciousness. In the same way, it's obvious on that mural that there is a point where there is no face to be identified. We could also say that with gestation, there must be a point where there is no consciousness, and there is a point where there is consciousness, but there is this gray area, which obviously is the reason, or at least part of the reason why it's such a fraught topic, that we cannot pinpoint exactly where that line is between the lack of consciousness and consciousness. Now, this video is not about expressing my views on pro-choice or pro-life, but I think it does offer some background to at least why that topic is so complicated. I think whatever the debate is, it has to focus on where that consciousness is, as impossible as that task might be, instead of, again, categorically saying that there is absolutely no point where there is lack of consciousness or absolutely no point where there is consciousness.